On February 12th, Putin and Trump had a phone conversation. After that, the US had effectively submitted a surrender letter on behalf of Ukraine and Europe to Russia. Chinese strategist Professor Wang Xiangshui points out, to understand this, you only need to notice two public statements from the Trump administration recently. The initial objective of Russia's special military operation was to prevent NATO's eastward expansion and stop Ukraine from joining this military encirclement. On February 14th, the New York Times reported that Trump had clearly stated that NATO would not accept Ukraine. Zelensky, in his speech at the Munich Security Conference, also submitted that the US had never supported Ukraine's NATO membership. This means Russia has fully achieved its strategic goal of halting NATO expansion, securing a de facto victory. As the Russia-Ukraine conflict developed, Russia set a new war objective: to annex 4 eastern Ukrainian provinces. On the same day as Trump's phone call with Putin, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stated at a national conference that restoring the borders to their pre-2014 state was an unrealistic and illusory goal in Ukraine's peace conditions. This US military statement signified that the US had, in effect, ceded Ukrainian territory, acknowledging that Russia had met its additional war objectives. That day, Trump and Putin talked for a full 90 minutes. Compared to the 3-year-long Russia-Ukraine conflict, this phone call was brief. But for Ukraine and Europe, it felt like an eternity because it was clear that in this conversation between old friends, they were no longer just listeners at the table. They had already been printed on the menu.
If you're not at the table in the international system, you're going to be on the menu. So
when Trump devoured Europe and Ukraine, he didn't even allow them to cry out. This year's Munich Security Conference, MSC, was supposed to focus on two main issues: how to end the war in Ukraine without capitulating to Russia, and how Europe could increase its defense spending. However, US Vice President J.D. Vance, who attended the conferences, did not discuss these topics. Instead, he launched a harsh critique of European allies, including the UK. Vance pointed out that Europe's biggest threat was not Russia nor China, but internal dangers. He criticized the elite class for using the judicial system to suppress free speech, overthrowing Romania's election results with unreliable intelligence, and deliberately ignoring public concerns about illegal immigration. These candid remarks did not lead to European tolerance. During those 20 minutes, Europe remained silent. The Guardian later commented, "The world order crumbled at that moment." But what the Guardian did not dare to admit was that the world order that Europe maintained was a complete mistake. Within this, two glaring misconceptions persist that Europe cannot seem to escape. The first misconception is underestimating Russia. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, Europe and the US tried to dismember Russia again through economic sanctions, color revolutions, and military pressure. These strategies were effective against small and medium-sized countries like Yugoslavia and in South America, but no EU member could withstand such tactics. However, they overlooked one point. Russia is not a small or medium-sized country. Trump's insight over Europe and previous US administrations was that for a country inheriting the Soviet nuclear arsenal and much of its military power, pushing it into a corner would backfire. Therefore, to bring Russia back to the negotiating table, it had to be given the respect its power warranted. For example, during the call, Trump even suggested inviting Russia back into the G8. This indicated that in the eyes of the US, Russia was no longer just leftovers from the Soviet Union, but had returned to the table as one of the main guests. This respect for objective reality, rooted in realism, might appear as the collapse of the world order to some politically naive European countries. But only nuclear powers like the US, China, and Russia can truly understand that to destroy an opponent, the entire world risks destruction. Trump's sacrifice of Europe's imagined world was in fact to preserve the real, albeit imperfect, world. Europe's second misconception is underestimating itself. Europe was not initially kicked off the table by the US. Rather, it voluntarily crawled under the table out of intellectual short-sightedness or laziness, leading to its current predicament. NATO has always been a tool used by the US to contain the Soviet Union and Russia under a bipolar system. Europe once lived in the shadow of the Red Giant and had to become part of this encirclement. The Cold War propaganda focused on interests, causing Europeans to overlook the costs. They believed that aligning with the US would bring safety and prosperity. This mentality still exists today, even after the Soviet Union's collapse. For instance, when the US proposed sanctions on Russia and aid to Ukraine, many terms clearly contradicted Europe's interests, such as abandoning stable, cheap Russian gas pipelines in favor of expensive US liquefied natural gas. But still, they were loyally implemented. Though today's Europeans excel at reflecting on their colonial history, they seem to have forgotten that when a government does not represent its people's interests and merely obeys another government, we call it a vassal state or a puppet government. This economic and security-blind obedience is Europe's self-exile and the most incoherent part of the world order they imagine. European countries like to toot slogans of equality and freedom, but when facing US policies on Russia, they fail to position themselves as sovereign states equal to the US and make their own independent decisions. J.D. Vance merely exposed their contradictory illusions, yet The Guardian now criticizes him for causing the collapse of the world order. In conclusion, for China, the US taking the initiative to ease relations with Russia is a positive signal. This means some Western policymakers are starting to reassess problems from a practical standpoint. Today, China is also a pole that can never be eliminated. If the US continues this pragmatic and materialist approach to reconsidering China-US issues, both countries and the international situation will experience more substantial and stable development. As for Europe and Ukraine, there are two moments when they should wake up from their collective illusions. One is the past, the other is now. Perhaps Europeans should consider having their own independent thoughts, as even a 3-year war in the region will be ended by an American president.
And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Top Picks. I am Mimi, and please leave a comment below with your feelings. Bye, see you next time.